They called him Arthur, a name that clung to myth like dew on steel, evoking the imagined glory of a once and future king. But the boy who bore it was not a legend. He was real, breathing, and born into a web of royal blood and brutal ambition. In 1187, in the stone chambers of Nantes, Brittany, a child was delivered to Constance, Duchess of Brittany, and Geoffrey Plantagenet, the fourth son of King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. This made Arthur the grandson of an empire builder and the nephew of Richard the Lionheart. But even before he could speak, Arthur was not merely a child. He was le fils du destin, the child of destiny. His father, Geoffrey, had died under suspicious circumstances just months before Arthur's birth, crushed in a tournament accident. Some said, but others whispered darker things. In his death, the infant Arthur became the next Duke of Brittany, a realm fiercely independent yet strategically vital to the Plantagenet dominions that stretched from the Scottish border to the foothills of the Pyrenees. Two crowns cast shadows over Arthur's cradle, the ducal coronet of Brittany, and the far heavier crown of England, once soaked in Norman conquest and continental warfare. But those crowns were not peacefully aligned. The court of England, fractious even in its strength, had never resolved the bitter question of succession, and as King Henry II aged into paranoia and illness, the crown itself became less an inheritance and more a weapon wielded between brothers, fathers, and sons. Arthur's lineage was immaculate. As the son of Henry II's fourth son, he stood in line behind only two figures, his childless uncle Richard and Richard's youngest brother John. But John, called Lackland even in youth for inheriting no territory, was ambitious and calculating. While Arthur was suckling at the breast of a Breton wet nurse, John was already eyeing lands, titles, and allegiances. The court of Brittany raised Arthur not only as a duke but as a symbol. His mother, Constance, strong-willed, politically astute, and fiercely protective, was determined to keep her son's inheritance secure. She refused to send Arthur to the English court for fostering, knowing the Plantagenet habit of turning children into pawns and pawns into corpses. Meanwhile, across the Channel, King Richard battled through the Holy Land and back, fighting Muslims, pirates, and his own European captors. But in England, no child awaited him, no son to continue the line, and so, reluctantly, Richard acknowledged Arthur as heir, though not without hesitation. The boy was French in tongue and education. His loyalty, some said, belonged more to Brittany and Paris than to London or Winchester. Still, Richard knew bloodlines could not be ignored. He summoned Arthur to Normandy, offered him a seat at court, and spoke the words that many believed would bind the next generation. "This is the boy who shall rule after me." But time in royal houses is rarely on the side of children. By the year 1199, Arthur was 12, slight, intense-eyed, and eerily composed. He was studying courtly Latin and military drill when the world changed again. In April, Richard the Lionheart died from an infected crossbow wound after a petty siege in central France. No son, no clear will. In the shock that followed, the kingdom fractured like old marble. Half the Plantagenet domains in France-Anjou, Touraine, and Maine swore fealty to Arthur, citing his direct bloodline. Brittany, of course, was his by birth, but England, Normandy, Aquitaine. They drifted to John, the surviving brother, who moved with speed and calculation. The decision split the empire in two. For the first time in his young life, Arthur stood not as a future hope, but as a living threat. And it would be his blood, royal and sacred, that would test whether birth alone could protect a child from becoming a ghost. It began not with a battle, but with a coronation. In May of 1199, just weeks after the death of Richard the Lionheart, John Plantagenet stood before the high altar of Westminster Abbey and was crowned King of England. The incense curled, the monks chanted, the holy oil was poured, and the crown, heavy with conquest and contradiction, was lowered onto the brow of a man who, by many reckonings, had no rightful claim. There was no Arthur in the abbey, no Breton delegation. No voice raised in the boy's name. John's coronation was not a matter of settled succession, but of speed. He had moved swiftly after Richard's death, securing the royal treasury at Chinon, sealing the English ports, and binding the Archbishop of Canterbury to his cause. The barons, weary of continental chaos, reluctantly yielded. Arthur, just 12, was across the Channel, a boy, and boys, in the minds of warriors, made poor kings in dangerous times, but the bloodlines did not lie. Arthur was the son of Geoffrey, who had been Richard's elder, and by strict primogeniture, he stood closer to the throne than John. The Plantagenet Empire had never formally embraced that principle, but now, the question of legitimacy crackled like dry tinder across every court in Europe. King Philip II of France, ever watchful for ways to weaken the Plantagenets, saw in Arthur a golden opportunity. He summoned the boy to his court, greeted him as Duke of Brittany and rightful King of England, and placed him under the protection of the French crown. Philip's gesture was not of kindness, but calculation. France and England had been locked in continental conflict for decades, and Arthur became a living wedge, a princely spear to drive into the flanks of John's fragile authority. Arthur, for his part, understood. Raised by a politically astute mother and educated in a court where allegiances were drawn like daggers, he knew the power of symbols. He was crowned Duke of Brittany by his own vassals, then paid homage to Philip for Anjou and Touraine. At 12, he stood in the great hall at Gournay and declared himself the lawful heir of Henry II, his small voice echoing with borrowed confidence. John, hearing the news in Normandy, burned with rage. He had seized the crown, but it slipped in his grip. His claim was fragile, his nobles unsteady, and the French court now flaunted a boy with royal blood and political backing. So John turned to violence, not immediate but methodical. First, he isolated Constance, Arthur's mother, sowing discord among the Breton barons. Then he launched a campaign to recover Anjou and Maine, using the language of rebellion to paint Arthur not as heir, but as a usurper. Arthur's advisers, most notably William de Roche, a seasoned soldier with split loyalties, urged caution, but caution and thrones are rarely compatible. Philip pressed the boy forward, using him as a standard-bearer for war. Thus the table was set a boy with a crown but no army, a man with an army but no moral right, and an empire shuddering at the fault lines between them. In England, murmurs stirred. Some barons began to wonder aloud whether Richard had meant to pass the crown to Arthur. Others feared the ambitions of John, who had already begun purging potential dissenters. Letters crossed the Channel in code. No one dared speak treason, but many asked questions that smelled of it. By the autumn of 1199, Brittany stood on the edge of civil war. In town squares and monastic corridors, people began to chant the old prophecy, "The child shall reign where the lion fell." But prophecy is no match for politics. And as winter fell over Normandy, John gathered his forces and began to prepare for the unthinkable to hunt his own nephew. It was a strange sight, the kind that only history's darkest turns could conjure a boy of 13, clad in fine wool and borrowed armour, raising a sword in the name of justice against his own blood. In the spring of 1202, Arthur of Brittany, flanked by French knights and Breton loyalists, crossed into Normandy under the banner of war. His destination, the strongholds of his grandfather's realm, castles once ruled by Henry II, now commanded by John Lackland. Arthur had not chosen this path. He had been guided, pushed, and in some ways offered a political gift wrapped in innocence. But as his name spread through the countryside, from Rouen to Angers, he became more than a pawn. He became a cause. John, meanwhile, had tightened his grip on England's continental holdings with paranoid precision. He issued writs of loyalty, punished suspected sympathisers, and recalled dubious barons to England under the guise of consultation. But his control of Normandy was brittle. Castles held by questionable lords peppered the landscape, and whole provinces still murmured Arthur's name not in hope, but in guilt. France had no such hesitation. King Philip II treated Arthur as both guest and instrument. He knighted the boy personally and assigned him senior commanders, including André de Chauvigny, a hardened nobleman whose loyalty to the French crown was unshakable. They moved with precision, capturing Le Mans, then Alençon, then Argentan. The campaign, though small in scale, struck at the heart of John's territorial pride. And yet, what unsettled the English king most was not the land taken, but the image Arthur, sword raised, issuing commands beside the fleur-de-lis. It was the picture of legitimacy, captured by minstrels and spies alike. But Arthur was still a boy. He did not yet grasp the deeper layers of loyalty or betrayal. In the spring, he turned his army toward an unlikely target, Mirebeau Castle. It was a strange decision, and one that would seal his fate. Mirebeau, perched above the Vienne River, was not a fortress of strategic significance, but it held someone of unspeakable political value, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Arthur's grandmother, the Queen Dowager, the matriarch of the Plantagenet dynasty. She was nearing 80 old, venerated, but still a symbol of legitimacy and authority. Capturing her would humiliate John and rally additional nobles to Arthur's side, or so his advisers told him. And so, against the better judgment of William de Roche, Arthur marched south. They laid siege in haste. His young forces surrounded the castle, cutting supply lines and attempting rudimentary breaches. Eleanor, aged but shrewd, sent desperate messengers through hidden passages to her youngest son John, pleading for aid. And to everyone's surprise, John moved fast. He was not known for speed. His indecision and brooding temperament were infamous. But now, perhaps driven by fear or fury, he gathered a small elite force and marched day and night through blazing summer heat. On August 1st, 1202, as Arthur and his men dined on dried meat outside the walls of Mirebeau, John's forces arrived like a storm. The battle was swift, brutal, and over by mid-morning. Arthur's army crumbled, his allies fled or were butchered. Dozens of French knights were captured, many never to be seen again. And Arthur, he was taken alive. Eyewitnesses recorded that he did not resist. When the door of his tent was torn open, and the red and gold of Plantagenet banners stormed inside, the boy stood silent. Perhaps he thought he would be spared. Perhaps he believed that blood even tainted by rivalry would protect him. He was wrong. John clasped him in iron manacles and had him paraded like a trophy before his men. No trial, no ransom, no family council. Just a boy in chains, surrounded by silence. The torches glowed like a constellation of vengeance as the victorious English forces rode into Le Mans, Arthur of Brittany bound in chains at the rear. The crowd stared, hushed. Some pitied the child. Others dared not meet his eyes. John rode ahead, triumphant and grim, making no effort to conceal the boy's humiliation. Arthur was now a prisoner of the man who had once cradled him as an infant. That bloodline, that sacred family bond so often invoked in ceremony and scripture, was nothing here. Here, in the smouldering aftermath of Mirebeau, John had turned from uncle to captor. The surviving French and Breton knights were dragged to dungeons, many executed without trial. John had no appetite for subtlety. The message was absolute challenge the king, and you vanish. But Arthur was different. Killing him would be easy but dangerous. The boy wasn't just a pretender. He was the rightful heir in the eyes of many nobles in Anjou, priests in Brittany, and whispering barons in England who still questioned John's legitimacy. To kill Arthur openly would be to invite martyrdom. So John chose shadows. He ordered Arthur transferred to Falaise, a Norman castle looming on a rocky promontory. There, behind limestone walls, the child was cut off from the world. No visitors, no letters, not even his mother was told his condition. The chroniclers record a silence so total that many thought Arthur dead already. But he wasn't. Not yet. Reports, fragmentary and whispered, suggest Arthur's confinement was cold and cruel. Guards described a boy who did not weep but stared, silent and rigid, as though already buried. He refused food for days at a time. Some said he murmured the name of his father Geoffrey over and over. Others claimed he tried to throw himself from the tower. What is certain is this: the longer he lived, the more John unravelled. The king's paranoia deepened. He rotated guards weekly, suspecting conspiracies. He had the cell reinforced. He burned letters from barons who inquired after Arthur, and he travelled compulsively, never staying long in any castle, as if haunted by a name he could not erase. Then came the letter from William de Roche, Arthur's former guardian, and one of the most powerful men in Anjou. It was blunt. Release the boy, or there will be war. De Roche had been loyal, a diplomat, a soldier, a man who had once advised Arthur to surrender. But now, horrified by the silence, he turned, and he was not alone. In Brittany, nobles began to raise militias. In France, Philip II began to speak of the murdered child, though Arthur still lived. And in England, the barons grew cold and calculating. For the first time, John's hold on power cracked, so he moved Arthur again, this time to Rouen, a darker and more imposing fortress, deeper within his crumbling realm. There, the boy was locked in a tower above the Seine. It was winter now. The river below ran grey and swollen. The wind screamed through the arrow slits, and the tower, tall and forgotten, seemed to vanish into the sky like a monument to disappearance. Then nothing. No letters, no sightings, no visitors, just absence. And then, one night in April 1203, the torches burned again. But this time, no army marched, no siege was laid, no battle was fought. Just a door opened and closed. That was the night Arthur vanished. The guards, when questioned months later, remembered nothing. Or rather, they said they were told to forget. No one could agree who had custody of the keys, and no one ever saw the boy again. The chroniclers of the age, cloaked in cautious Latin and metaphor, said it plainly enough: Arthur was removed from the course of life, and Johnny never spoke of it, not once. Spring came late to Normandy in 1203. The snowmelt dripped down the moss-covered stones of Rouen Castle, soaking the soil beneath the tower walls, the tower where Arthur had last been seen. Birds returned, merchants reopened their stalls, but Arthur did not return, and Rouen's silence thickened like fog. At court, the mood had changed. John had won a battle at Mirbeau but lost something deeper. His once confident retinue had grown brittle. Conversations ended abruptly when his name entered the room. The nobles drank less, joked less, and exchanged glances more often. Whispers rippled like silk between courtiers. Have you heard he was seen that night? But why would the king visit the tower himself? There were no proclamations, no ceremony of exile, no execution notice. The boy had simply stopped existing. The clergy grew uneasy. Archbishop Hubert of Canterbury reportedly confronted John in private, urging clarity, justice, or at the very least a burial. John is said to have stared through him, unmoved. There is no body to bury, he reportedly replied, and with that, the king turned away. But that statement simple. Cold was precisely what terrified his enemies. No body, no grave, no closure, just a disappearance. England's barons, already cautious of John's consolidation of power, began to murmur. Some believed Arthur had been stabbed by John himself during a drunken rage. Others claimed he had been starved slowly, cruelly, to erase all trace of royal murder. There was even a tale that he had been tied to a stone and thrown into the Seine, where the river would carry his story far from the crown. None of it could be proved, and yet the certainty was total: Arthur was dead, and John had killed him. Across the Channel, the French court moved quickly. King Philip II summoned chroniclers, painters, and poets to construct a martyr, a boy prince devoured by English tyranny. It was propaganda, yes, but it was effective. Town criers in Paris described Arthur's innocence. Bishops mourned him from pulpits, and coins were minted bearing his face in Brittany, despite the fact that he was gone. Brittany, which had once fought under his banner, now mourned as though he were a lost saint. Noble families who had sat on the fence now turned fully against the English. The duchy declared itself in revolt. French troops marched into Maine, and the delicate balance John had relied on collapsed. Meanwhile, inside his own court, John's behaviour became erratic. He held long, disjointed councils. He demanded absolute silence about the matter of his nephew. He accused his chancellor of treason, then reappointed him 2 weeks later. At feasts, he drank heavily more than even his gluttonous forebears and laughed too loudly at cruel jokes. It was clear to those around him the boy in the tower was haunting the man on the throne. And yet, the official records remained pristine. Arthur's name was quietly excised from royal documents. His titles, Duke of Brittany, Count of Anjou, were reassigned or left empty. No charter acknowledged his imprisonment. No scroll marked his death. Even the chroniclers struggled. Roger of Wendover wrote cryptically that Arthur was detained in Rouen and thereafter never seen in life. Ralph of Coggeshall was more direct. The common opinion was that John killed him with his own hand, but no official record confirmed it. This, too, was part of the horror. Not the blood, but the bureaucracy, the careful silence, the paperwork that omitted a life. It was as if the world had agreed to erase him. All that remained was a chain of shadows, a boy who had marched for justice, crowned with hope, and vanished into a tower, and a king who had crowned himself in fear and would spend the rest of his reign hunted by the name he refused to utter. He had once been a child in velvet, Arthur of Brittany, barely 13, slight of frame and noble of bearing, had once stood beside kings. His name had been sung in courts and whispered in prayers. But within the walls of Rouen Castle, he became something else, a threat made flesh, not by any act of violence, not by any rebellion, but by sheer fact, by being. In that final spring of his life, Arthur was not merely a prisoner, he was a problem of legitimacy, a knot that John of England could not cut cleanly, nor leave unpicked. Alive, the boy was a rallying banner. Dead, he risked becoming a martyr, but fading slowly, disappearing in bureaucratic shadow. That, perhaps, was John's cruelest calculation, and yet something shifted in April 1203. The chroniclers, sparse, cautious, and laced with inference, speak of a night, one night, when the nature of Arthur's captivity changed. That evening John arrived in Rouen unannounced. No formal procession, no heralds, just a cloak, a torch, and a small retinue. He had not visited the castle in months, and his sudden presence caused unease even among his own men. Guards were rotated without reason, servants dismissed. Records from that night vanish abruptly in the royal rolls. It was as if history itself turned its face away. We do not know what passed between John and Arthur that night. No document records it. But one account written decades later in a monastic margin in Flanders claims that John entered the tower alone. According to that account, he carried a dagger. It says Arthur was asleep when John entered, that the boy woke, that he sat up, frightened, that he tried to speak, that John said nothing, that he knelt, then rose, that he left the room in silence, that Arthur remained behind alive, but by morning he was gone. The next day, a veil of normalcy descended over the castle. Meals were served, horses were shod, messages dispatched, but Arthur's chamber remained sealed. When asked, the guards shrugged or crossed themselves. When questioned more deeply, they said nothing. And then John did something that astonished even his allies. He ordered the arrest of William de Roche, Arthur's former protector, the very man who had once been loyal to the crown. It was a strategic misstep. De Roche had supporters across Anjou, Poitou, and even in parts of England. His arrest sent shockwaves through the nobility, signalling that John's war was not just against enemies, but against those with conscience. 1 week later, De Roche was released without explanation, but the damage had been done. Nobles who had once hedged their bets began openly aligning with Philip II. Towns raised French standards. Garrisoned castles changed allegiance without a fight. The rumours spread like wildfire. The boy is dead, and worse, the king killed him with his own hands. John, for his part, denied nothing and explained nothing. His silence screamed louder than words. Letters from English barons to their French counterparts became colder, shorter, increasingly cautious. Some stopped altogether. The Church, too, began to grow restless. Pope Innocent III, though distant in Rome, received word of Arthur's disappearance and began making inquiries through ecclesiastical channels. There was no reply. It was in this sudden, echoing absence, this historical vacuum, that Arthur transformed. No longer a boy, now a symbol, a spectral monarch, a prince whose very absence dethroned faith in the crown. And for John, the irony was bitter. He had silenced the voice only to amplify the ghost. By midsummer of 1203, Rouen Castle stood beneath a sky heavy with omens. Thunderheads rolled above its towers, and the Seine, bloated with rain, lapped hungrily at its stone foundations. Inside, the upper chamber where Arthur had once been held remained sealed, unvisited, untouched, a room preserved by fear. No body was found, no confession issued, no tomb constructed. It was as if the tower had swallowed the boy whole like a mouth that would not chew, only consume, and still King John said nothing. This silence was no longer strategic. It was corrosive. Every week that passed without word fueled a tide of speculation and revolt. Brittany rose first. The Breton lords, once divided by clan and oath, unified under a banner not of conquest but of grief. They called Arthur le Martyr Perdu the Lost Martyr. His image, once youthful and uncertain, became one of solemn defiance in the tapestries of the region. Then Anjou erupted. Castles once loyal to John now flew the lilies of France. Philip II moved quickly to capitalise on the outrage. He declared John guilty of Arthur's death in absentia and seized nearly all of his continental holdings under feudal pretext. One by one, the great strongholds of the Plantagenet Empire fell: Château Gaillard, Loches, Chinon. The Plantagenet Empire, once stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, began to disintegrate, all because a boy had vanished, and no one was allowed to speak his name. Even John's own allies turned cautious. William Marshal, the king's most formidable knight, reportedly refused to discuss the matter, even under royal pressure. Other nobles simply left court or sent sons abroad, fearing the same fate might befall their heirs if the crown turned paranoid once more. Whispers became certainty. A Dominican friar, travelling through Normandy in late 1203, wrote in his journal, "The Tower of Rouen has no windows facing east. It receives no sun. They say the boy was placed in a lower cell with only stone and silence, and that he wept only once when he asked for bread and was given none." That sentence spread faster than any army. It became part of sermons, stitched into laments sung by Breton widows, etched into the underside of church pews. In England, ballads emerged, veiled critiques of tyranny wrapped in metaphor. One spoke of a nightingale in a cage that ceased singing when the roses died. Another of a child drowned by the tide because the lighthouse keeper had doused the flame. John ordered these songs banned. He threatened scribes and imprisoned minstrels, but repression only added to the mystique. Even the weather seemed to turn against him. The winter that followed was bitter. Crops failed. Plague touched the coasts, and with each hardship the people murmured that it was because of Arthur that the land would remain cursed until the truth was spoken. But truth, in John's court, was not welcome. Instead, there were absences, redacted scrolls, burned letters, and one great hole where a name used to be. And so Arthur of Brittany remained not dead, not alive, but erased. His place in royal lineages was struck through, his seal was broken, his inheritance confiscated, and yet, somehow, he grew stronger in silence. The tower at Rouen never gave him back. No guards confessed. No body was ever recovered. But his legend did not need a corpse. It needed only the knowledge that he had been there and was there no longer, and that someone with a crown had decided that was enough. The men who stood watch at Rouen Castle in the spring of 1203 had little in common. Some were English knights with Plantagenet loyalty bred into the bone. Others were Norman mercenaries hired by gold and fear. But in the years that followed, they shared one trait: silence. Not the honourable silence of loyalty, but the kind born of dread, of implication, of knowing too much. Many left service abruptly. Some returned to England and vanished from records. A few entered monasteries. And some, when pressed by clergy or questioned by nobles in hushed, private chambers, would speak only in fragments. One guard, whose name is lost to time but whose confession survives in a dusty vellum tucked inside the Abbey of Saint-Ouen, told a monk, "We were given orders not to speak to the boy, only to pass food through the slit, bread, mostly, sometimes salted fish. But near the end, the tray returned untouched." Another, in an unsigned note preserved in the Royal Archive of Chillon, wrote, "He cried on the third night, not loud, a kind of animal whimpering, like he didn't want to be heard. We weren't allowed to go in, but I almost did. I almost broke the rule. I wonder if it would have saved him. Such testimony, scattered and unverifiable, may seem little more than folklore, but their consistency is eerie." The guards describe an atmosphere that changed after John's unannounced visit. Patrols grew tighter, doors bolted from the outside, and the prison kitchen receiving fewer deliveries. And then, on one night, a date none dared mark it stopped altogether. No tray to prepare, no footsteps above, no echo of movement from the tower chamber, just absence. One soldier, long retired and blind when he finally spoke to a bishop years later, said, "There was a boat, moored beneath the tower, just after moonset. Not the usual guard boat, something smaller. 2 men rowed it upriver. No lights. We were told it was inspection duty, but we never saw it return. Could it have been the disposal of a body, or merely another cloak and dagger act to further muddy the trail? We will never know. But the psychological toll on the men involved is evident. At least 4 of the tower's former wardens joined monastic orders within a year. One went mad and tore out his own tongue, according to a letter by Abbot Theodoric of Bec. Another Sir L. de Ferret was found drowned in a river near Lisieux, pockets weighted with stones. None left a clean record, and still the truth found cracks in the stone. Bards turned the tale into allegory, the boy in the black tower, the heir of breadless days. In these songs, the guards became shadows, eyes watching from slits, hearts half turned to mercy and half to fear. Even the church, which had held its tongue during the political chaos, began to move. Quiet letters from bishops in Normandy reached the Pope. There was no direct accusation, only concern that an anointed child of royal blood has vanished from our protection. Rome did not respond immediately, but the very fact that such questions were being asked and recorded meant that John's walls were thinning, and he knew it. He began shifting his court from castle to castle every few weeks, never sleeping in the same bed for long. He replaced his personal guard. He excommunicated a bishop who preached openly about Arthur's likely death. He could not erase the boy from the whispers. For the tower guards, the price of obedience was spiritual erosion. Some would die with their secrets, others would carry them to the grave, and one, a man named Giles, who decades later confessed to a Franciscan friar on his deathbed, said simply, "He did not die in violence, he died in silence, and we let him." The truth, like Arthur, was never found, not beneath Rouen's tower stones, not in the shallows of the Seine, not in the scrolls of the chancery or the annals of monastic scribes. There was no grave, no tomb, no royal edict, no solemn requiem echoing through a cathedral nave, only absence. The year 1203 bled into 1204, and with it, the last official hopes of locating Arthur of Brittany alive. The boy who had been declared duke, who had paid homage to the French king, who had marched with knights at his back, was now a ghost in royal memory. But his disappearance did not fade with time. It deepened, hardened, curled inward like a fist. John refused to speak of it, not in court, not in letters, not in private confessions. When pressed by his closest allies, and there were fewer now, he simply stared through them, as if denying Arthur's name was the final test of loyalty. The court chroniclers followed suit. The patent rolls, close rolls, pipe rolls, all administrative lifeblood of the medieval crown, grew quiet. Where Arthur's titles once stood, there were blank spaces. Where his name had been affixed to noble duties or ducal privileges, it was now replaced by silence or erased with fresh ink. It was a bureaucracy of forgetting, and yet, outside the scribes' chambers, the rumours thrived. In Anjou, a child's skull was found in the well of a ruined keep. Locals swore it belonged to Arthur. It did not. In Brittany, A river priest claimed to have seen a pale arm drift downstream in the moonlight, a gold ring still clinging to a finger. The body was never recovered. In Paris, a holy woman claimed visions of a boy starved on stone, whispering prayers to a god who would not come. Even these fragments became dangerous. John sent spies across the Channel. He bribed chroniclers to amend earlier entries. He tried to outpace the story by denying it existed. But stories, unlike people, cannot be imprisoned. In truth, John's silence was not mistaken for innocence, it was treated as guilt made ritual. Philip II of France moved with brutal cunning. Citing Arthur's murder, he declared John unfit to hold any land in France. Normandy was seized. Brittany formalised its rebellion. Maine and Anjou slipped from English fingers like sand. The Plantagenet Empire, once the envy of Europe, shrank before the ghost of a child. Even in England, Arthur's name became a spectre. Barons who had backed John out of convenience now recoiled. Their heirs grew wary. Few turned quietly toward Rome, asking the Pope to look more closely at a king who seemed untouched by fear or penance. The Church's silence, too, began to crack. In 1205, Pope Innocent III, deeply entangled in European politics, sent a legate to Normandy. Officially, it was to oversee ecclesiastical appointments. Unofficially, it was to ask about the boy. The legate found nothing, no witnesses, no grave, only guards who had disappeared, scribes who remembered nothing, and a tower chamber sealed in mystery. John responded with venom. He threatened excommunication. He cancelled church revenues. He began his long and bitter war with the papacy, one that would, in time, bring all of England to its knees. And so the legacy of Arthur's vanishing began to metastasize, not just as a tragedy, but as a political cancer. A kingdom that had once conquered abroad now could not hold itself together at home. All this from a boy denied a burial, no crown, no headstone, no final blessing from a priest, only silence, only shadows, and a king who sat atop a throne built not on justice, but on the unmarked grave of his nephew. In Brittany, they lit candles in stone churches. In Paris, they carved his face into stained glass, idealized, solemn, eternal. Arthur of Brittany had become more powerful in death than he had ever been in life. He was no longer the awkward boy soldier, no longer the captive prince. He was the phantom heir, the stolen future of an empire. King Philip II of France understood the utility of grief. Within weeks of Arthur's confirmed disappearance, he held public masses in Notre Dame. Priests spoke of innocence betrayed. Monks copied elegiac verses comparing Arthur to Abel, sacrificed by Cain. The parallels were deliberate, theological, and politically lethal. Philip's court artists began producing illuminated manuscripts that depicted Arthur not in chains, but robed in gold, ascending toward heaven, eyes lifted, mouth closed, holding a broken scepter in his small hand, a divine martyr, a holy orphan. It was exquisite propaganda, and it worked. Philip issued a formal decree: John Lackland, King of England, was henceforth a perjurer and a murderer of blood. France would no longer recognise him as Duke of Normandy or overlord of any French land. This was no mere insult. It was a call to war under legal and moral authority. The Capetian army began to move with force. Border castles fell like dominoes. Norman knights defected, some citing Arthur's death as their final cause of conscience. In Brittany, resistance turned into revolution. Arthur's name was inscribed in every chapel. Nobles who had once doubted his claim now built chapels in his memory. In Nantes, an orphanage was founded in his name, Maison du Prince Perdu, and in the ballads sung in village squares, Arthur's death was recited as sacred history. In tower tall and dungeon deep, the boy did sigh, the stones did weep, his bread was dust, his bed was bone, and now he walks the stars alone. The English crown had not merely lost a nephew, it had created a legend. Even among the English people, sympathy stirred. The story reached the countryside as fragments a child locked away by a fearful king, a silence too deep to be innocence. Some barons, ashamed, sent offerings to Breton shrines. Others opened letters from Philip's envoys and did not report them to the crown. In London, Anonymous flyers appeared in marketplaces, showing a boy's silhouette with a crown made of thorns. He ruled no kingdom but our memory. The woodcut was crude, but its message could not be clearer. The clerical world, too, responded. Preachers across France began to insert Arthur into sermons not as a political figure, but a warning. That power feared purity. That fear devoured its own blood. And Arthur's story became a parable. A holy boy, a silent death, a throne that could not tolerate truth. John, still refusing to issue any official account, found himself increasingly isolated. His court shrank. Alliances faltered. France grew stronger by the day. And yet, despite all the prayers, all the songs, all the carved stone, Arthur remained what he had been since that April night. Missing. No bones unearthed, no confession secured, no moment of closure. Just a name now carved in grief. Arthur Plantagenet, Duke of Brittany, Prince of Anjou, and perhaps, for one breathless moment in history, the king who never was. By 1204, King John sat not on a throne of power, but on a throne of erosion. The Plantagenet dominion, once a vast and glittering patchwork of territories, stitched together by cunning, marriage, and conquest, was unravelling thread by thread. And at the centre of that unravelling, always, was the boy he had tried to erase. Arthur's name was rarely uttered in John's court. It had become a forbidden word, like a curse that might summon rebellion. But his shadow lingered, in every barren sideways glance, in every whispered negotiation, in every prayer muttered beneath breath by lords who had sons of their own. The loss of Normandy hit first. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a psychological wound. Normandy had been the cradle of the dynasty, the very soil from which the English crown had grown since the days of William the Conqueror. But after Arthur's disappearance, its castles fell swiftly. Philip II, weaponizing grief like a sword, moved with impunity. Even John's most trusted allies in Normandy began surrendering without resistance. The final insult came when Rouen itself, the very city that had swallowed Arthur, opened its gates to the French king in 1204 without a fight. It was as if the land had turned against John. The English barons took note. They had long tolerated John's excesses, his heavy taxation, his feuds with the church, his erratic temper, but this was different. This was weakness. And weakness in a king was a dangerous contagion. Rebellion simmered beneath the surface. But John's response was not one of humility. He doubled down, enforcing harsh levies to fund a war he could no longer win, seizing lands from suspected dissenters, imprisoning wives and sons to ensure baronial obedience. His rage turned inward, his circle smaller and colder. His paranoia became policy, and all the while Arthur remained the silent wound. The loss of Normandy had economic consequences as well. Trade routes collapsed, revenue dried up. Merchants began bypassing England entirely in favour of Capetian markets. The treasury dwindled. To recover, John sold justice to the highest bidder, literally auctioning off court rulings, sheriff appointments, and legal exemptions. The people began to murmur, "What kind of king sells the law?" The church had grown restless too. John's ongoing feud with Pope Innocent III, sparked by his refusal to accept the papal nominee for Archbishop of Canterbury, had led to England's excommunication in 1209. That meant no baptisms, no weddings, no last rites. It meant entire villages lived and died without the sacraments. And the clergy began to whisper what the people already believed: the excommunication was not just about church politics. It was divine punishment for the boy in the tower. John was now isolated from both heaven and earth. His attempts to maintain control grew more desperate. He travelled constantly, making appearances not out of strength but out of fear, afraid that any court left alone too long might forget who their king was. He wrote dozens of charters a month, hoping to paper over rebellion with bureaucracy. But none of it worked. The crown that John had stolen, a crown that once gleamed atop the brows of Henry II, and Richard the Lionheart now rested heavy and cursed upon his own. He had no love, no allies, no heir that the barons trusted. And always, in the dark, quiet moments of night, when the torchlight flickered low and his attendants withdrew, He was left alone with the knowledge that it was not France or fortune that had undone him. It was a boy, a bloodline, a silence that echoed louder than war. Arthur had been erased, but his absence had become a reckoning. And John, England's crowned king, wore a title wrapped in ghosts. In the decade after Arthur's disappearance, England became a haunted realm, not haunted by ghosts in white, but by whispers in cloisters, by silence at royal banquets, by the growing weight of what had been done, or more precisely, what had never been acknowledged. The realm did not need to see Arthur's body to feel his absence. He lingered in the collective imagination like a stain in stone. Ballads and broadsides spread, even as John's men tried to suppress them. These weren't polished works of court poets, but the simple refrains of shepherds, brewers, and travelling singers. Airborne of lion's claw, gone beneath the crown's black law, no wind, no bell, no final cry, just walls and whispers, and goodbye. In some villages, mothers refused to name their sons John. In others, children were taught to murmur Arthur's name during storms, a folk prayer for lost innocence. Shrines to Saint Arthur began to appear in coastal chapels from Brittany to Devon, unofficial and unsanctioned. They were adorned with crude carvings, a child in a cell, a crown of thorns, a closed door. John sent clerics to tear them down. It only made them multiply. The church, meanwhile, kept its disapproval just below the surface. The Pope, already enraged by John's refusal to submit to papal authority, viewed the mystery of Arthur as yet another wound in a bleeding realm. He offered no direct censure but permitted enough space for bishops to imply one, and in courts across Europe, John's name was now spoken with revulsion. He was the uncle who starved a king. In Castile, a court poet compared him to Herod. In Rome, a cardinal nicknamed him Johannes Silence, not John the Silent, but John of Silence, the man whose power came from refusing to speak the truth. But perhaps the most devastating legacy was not in poetry, nor rebellion, nor politics. It was in the slow death of trust. The barons no longer believed the king would keep oaths. They saw in Arthur's erasure the edge of a new rule, one where legitimacy meant nothing, where bloodlines were threads to be cut, where power did not pass from father to son but from fear to fear. John noticed. When he summoned councils, fewer nobles arrived. When he called for troops, fewer banners were raised. He began employing foreign mercenaries, men who owed him nothing but gold and would fight without asking why. In 1212, a group of English barons formed a secret pact, the Comitatus, as some called it. Their oath was simple: no king who would silence a child shall silence the land. That oath would echo into the coming years, all the way to Runnymede and the signing of Magna Carta. But even that story, the most famous in England's constitutional history, began not in law, but in a tower, with a boy, a cousin, a rightful heir, one who had never raised a sword in England, never sat in the House of Lords, never crowned or consecrated, and yet he had become the fulcrum upon which the Plantagenet legacy teetered. And beneath it all, the question remained unanswered. What happened that night in Rouen, and why? If John were innocent, did he never ask the world to prove it? The silence, like the tower, still stands. It was not in a court, not in a letter, not in a chapel or chamber or battlefield. The last time King John is known to have spoken the name Arthur was in a private meeting with a single man, a papal envoy named Pandulf Verraccio, dispatched by Pope Innocent III to negotiate peace and penance. It was the summer of 1213. England had been under papal interdict for 4 years. No marriages, no masses, no holy ground for the dead. And the king was finally crumbling beneath the weight. Pandulf, austere and sharp-eyed, met John in Winchester. The meeting was not recorded by English scribes, but later chroniclers, including Matthew Paris, preserved its details with ominous clarity. The envoy came not only to discuss the Pope's terms, but to question the moral condition of the realm. A king, Pandulf is said to have said, must carry the weight of all blood shed under his silence. What followed was a strange, broken silence. And then, according to the account, John whispered, he was a boy. He could not have ruled. They would have torn him apart. It was not a confession. It was not a denial, just a statement of inevitability, as though Arthur's death had been a fact of the universe, not a choice, as though the world or God had demanded it, and John had simply obeyed. Pandulf said nothing. He handed John the Pope's conditions. John, cornered by rebellion at home and holy wrath from Rome, bent the knee. He surrendered England to the papacy, symbolically handing his crown to the envoy, who returned it only after John swore fealty to Rome. It was a humiliating gesture, but in it, John believed he had purchased absolution. He had not. Even after submitting to the church, the whispers did not stop. Even after paying tribute to Rome, the nobles did not forgive. Even after joining the crusade and swearing loyalty to the cross, no one forgot what had happened in Rouen. Because forgiveness, like truth, needs acknowledgement, and John never gave it. In later years, when pressured again about Arthur, John did not repeat the name. He referred to him only as the boy, never my nephew, never the Duke, never Arthur. The ghost remained, but the name was locked away, a relic too dangerous to utter, too damning to face. That silence, deliberate and sharpened with age, poisoned everything it touched. When barons finally rose against him in 1215, forcing him to sign Magna Carta at Runnymede, it was not only about taxes or military abuses, it was about trust or its absence. It was about a king who could erase a child and then pretend it never happened. A king who could rewrite the story and expect the world to believe it. Even the preamble of Magna Carta echoes the injury. It reasserts the rights of heirs, the importance of due process, the protection of the innocent. Every line is a response to the void Arthur left behind. The last time John spoke his nephew's name, it was not with mourning, it was with dread. Because the truth was, this John had won the crown, but in doing so, had forfeited the future. And Arthur the boy, the heir, the silence had taken the heart of the realm with him into the dark. Years passed, the century turned, kings rose and fell, and still, the tower at Rouen stood tall, grey, unblinking as if waiting for someone to come looking. For decades, no one dared open the upper chamber where Arthur had last been seen. It was not locked by key, but by fear, by silence, by tradition. Royal guards avoided it. Chroniclers omitted it. Even the cleaning staff swept around it, as though dust itself could mourn. But time, indifferent to secrets, wears all things down. In 1247, nearly 45 years after Arthur vanished, a minor renovation was ordered by Henry III, John's son and Arthur's cousin. The castle needed reinforcement against potential French aggression. Masons and labourers were summoned, and scaffolding wrapped the old tower like a cocoon. Among the orders was one to replace the flooring in the upper levels, which had begun to rot. What the workers found beneath the floorboards remains one of history's most unsettling footnotes. The account comes to us in fragments, a monastic letter from a clerk in Caen, a footnote in a lost annal copied centuries later, a brief mention in the margins of a chronicle now housed in the Bodleian Library. They found bones, small, fragile, not complete. The skull was missing, but the rest was unmistakable, the skeleton of a child, bound at the wrists with the iron chain, curled inward as if in sleep. The work stopped immediately. A priest was summoned. The sight was blessed, and then just as swiftly the findings were sealed. The bones were taken by a royal emissary and never seen again. No record of reburial, no royal proclamation, no inquiry. Only a sudden surge in royal charity donations, and a curious rebuilding of an altar in Westminster that same year, dedicated to all lost souls of the House of Plantagenet. Was it Arthur? Most historians refrain from saying so definitively, but the timing, the location, the secrecy, it was enough. And in the absence of certainty, legend did the rest. Ballads began again, this time with new verses. They found his bones beneath the floor, chained in silence, wrapped in lore, no crown, no name, no trumpet sound, just dust and iron in the ground. The discovery or its whisper reignited public interest. A new generation of scribes revisited old scrolls. Questions long buried found breath again. What kind of king dies surrounded by silence? What kind of realm lets its heirs vanish? John, of course, was long gone by then, his reign ending in 1216 with a death as ignoble as his legacy. Dysentery, they said. He died alone, fleeing rebel forces, his baggage train swallowed by a tidal river in the East Anglian marshes. Some chroniclers called it divine justice. Others said Arthur had taken his crown in the end, not by force but by curse. But what remained, what truly lingered, was not John's death but Arthur's unknown resting place. Even now, no grave bears his name, no tomb in Fontevraud, no effigy in Westminster. Only a story, folded again and again in the parchment of history, softened by memory and sharpened by shame. A child born for the throne, and the chamber that made him disappear. By the time the 13th century ended, the Plantagenet line had regained its surface strength. Henry III's long, uneasy reign gave way to Edward I, a warrior king of brute ambition who cast his gaze toward Wales and Scotland rather than the past. English banners flew again. Laws were codified. Castles were built. The kingdom bristled with might. But beneath the stonework and charters, the ghost remained. Arthur of Brittany, who had never ruled, never been crowned, never even reached manhood, still lingered in the cracks of royal memory. And every new heir that took the throne after John did so with a quiet question at their back. What must be buried to wear a crown? His name had been removed from the line of succession, his titles reassigned, and yet he was not forgotten. In fact, it was his erasure that made him unforgettable, because nothing inspires legend like a silence that should have been a scream. In Brittany, the cult of Arthur continued in secret. Pilgrims visited wells and chapels dedicated to the lost duke. Stories emerged of miracles of children healed after invoking his name, of a blind woman who claimed she saw a boy with a golden chain ascending a hill near Rouen in her dreams. The English crown ignored it all. Officially, there was no saint named Arthur, no relics, no feast day. But the clergy knew better. They heard the confessions. They read the marginalia. They watched noble families name their sons after a boy whose grave could not be found. And in political memory, Arthur became a warning, a whisper at coronations, a lesson carved in no stone but passed through generations. Blood alone does not protect. Silence does not sanctify. Erasure is never complete. John had tried to secure his rule by removing the only person who could challenge it, but in doing so, he created a martyr that no sword could defeat. Every rebellion that followed bore traces of that wound. In 1327, when Edward II was deposed by his own wife and son, the chroniclers recalled the fate of young Arthur as precedent. In 1399, when Richard II was overthrown and vanished from public view, some whispered he had met an Arthurian fate, another king turned to shadow. Even in Shakespeare's King John, written centuries later, the playwright could not ignore the story. He gave Arthur a voice, gave him lines of sorrow, of longing, of dignity. I'm not worth this coil that's made for me. He talks to me that never had a son. The playwright, like history, could not abide the silence. Today, no monument bears Arthur's full story, no palace hall keeps his portrait. But perhaps the truest monument is the one laid in the conscience of a nation, a child bound in iron and secrecy, buried not in earth, but in the fear of remembrance, and a crown that ever since has had to carry the weight of what it once destroyed to remain upon the head that wears it. The stone tower still stands, the wind still cuts through its narrow slits, the stairs still spiral towards silence, the chamber at the top once locked, once feared, once emptied, now echoes with nothing but time, no plaque, no prayer, just dust settling in the places memory forgot. No one knows where Arthur of Brittany lies, not under marble, not beneath stained glass, not even in legend, fully because his story is not one of triumph, nor even martyrdom. It is one of slow vanishing, of a boy born between two crowns and crushed by both. He did not die in battle. He did not sit upon a throne. His weapons were parchment promises, his allies lords of foreign tongues, his only rebellion the threat of blood that was his by birth. And yet he left a mark that could not be erased. It lived in the hush that fell whenever his name surfaced in court, in the empty chair at councils, in the tight-lipped glances of scribes who knew better than to write what they remembered. It lives still, in every crown handed to a child too young to wield it, in every silence issued by power afraid of being undone, in every history book with a blank space where his fate should be. The tower may crumble, the scrolls may rot, the memory may flicker, but somewhere, in the unspoken place between right and rule, the shadow of Arthur waits not for justice, perhaps, but simply to be named. And that, at last, is what the silence cannot stop.